The Supreme Court just handed down a major victory to dozens, maybe hundreds of January 6th defendants, and today's ruling will probably also affect the election interference case against former President Donald Trump. I'll explain how in a second, but first, this was another 6-3 ruling, but what was interesting was the makeup of justices in the majority and the dissent. The majority opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts and joined by Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Jackson. The dissent was written by Justice Amy Coney Barrett and was joined by Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. So this whole case centers around a former police officer who was indicted on charges of assaulting a federal officer and entering or remaining in a restricted area on January 6th. But he was also charged with obstruction of an official proceeding for his alleged actions on January 6th. Now that crime carries a punishment of 20 years in prison, and that former officer sued, saying the Justice Department used an overly broad interpretation of the law when they charged him with that serious crime. That law has been on the books for decades and has two parts. Part one talks about the crime of altering, destroying, mutilating, or concealing a record, document, or other object, or attempting to do so with the intent to impair the object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding. But the law also says a defendant violates the law if he or she obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so. The former officer said he didn't alter any document or evidence on January 6th, so he shouldn't have been charged with this obstruction crime. And today, the majority of the Supreme Court agreed, saying he did not impair the integrity of records, documents, or other objects used during an official proceeding. So if they let the Justice Department's broad interpretation of the law stand, it will have a ripple effect. Justice Roberts writes, that novel interpretation would criminalize a broad swath of prosaic conduct, exposing activists and lobbyists alike to decades in prison. In her dissent, Justice Barrett says the majority is absolutely wrong. She writes, statutes often go further than the problem that inspires them, and under the rules of statutory interpretation, we stick to the text anyway. The court, abandoning that approach, does textual backflips to find some way, any way, to narrow the reach of the law. I respectfully dissent. Now let's talk about how this may impact the former police officer who sued, the other January 6th defendants who have been charged with the same crime, and potentially even former President Donald Trump. So I'll start with the former police officer first. This ruling says his case will now go back to the lower court, and that lower court, with this Supreme Court ruling in hand, will have to determine whether his obstruction charge can stand. It probably will not. In reality, this obstruction charge was also issued to hundreds of other January 6th defendants, so it is possible that their obstruction charges will also be dropped. It's also possible that if they were sentenced on this charge, that sentence may be reduced or eliminated. However, it is important to understand the majority of these January 6th defendants were not only charged with obstruction, they were charged with other crimes too, and those will not be impacted by today's ruling at all. And that brings me to former President Donald Trump. His federal criminal election interference case being brought by special counsel Jack Smith does include this same obstruction charge. Now, his circumstances are different, especially when it comes to the records part of it, but because of today's ruling, it's entirely possible those specific obstruction charges could be dropped. But it is important for you to understand, Trump, like these other January 6th defendants, was charged with other crimes besides obstruction. So this ruling will not impact those charges. Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a statement after today's ruling saying he is disappointed by today's decision, but says, for the cases affected by today's decision, the department will take appropriate steps to comply with the court's ruling. So if you want to read this lengthy and interesting ruling for yourself, I will email it out to you tonight in my Newsgirl News Roundup email, so make sure you sign yourself up.